This is a total collaborative effort, as is our annual conference. Every year, some organization steps up and says, we would like to organize this year's conference. Haystack is involved, the central organizers of Haystack are involved, but it is so much about the institution putting it on. And even before I make all the formal comments, please join me in thanking Michigan State for putting on a great conference, phenomenal. I started my career totally coincidentally at Michigan State, and so for me it's just a real treat to be back here again. And although I've taught at many wonderful institutions and teach at a great one now, I have to say I will always bleed green, which if you're a Michigan State person, you know what that means. This morning I have 3 jobs, and they will all be very brief since I know we are all very excited to be hearing Scott Weingart. First, I hope you will join me in a warm round of applause, as you have done, for our conference organizers who put together an absolutely stellar conference on the art and science of the digital humanities. If you missed the laser show of Pink Floyd last night at the planetarium, I believe it's going to be running throughout the conference. Is that correct? That it will be, the Pink Floyd show is going to be running throughout the conference and people? No? That's wrong. I was given misinformation. You missed a good one. It was really, really fun. And the programmer who did all that hand coding, I don't know if he's here, but please convey our huge admiration and thanks. It was really quite a great way to get a conference going. I also want to thank just a few people who I know by name and many, many others here who I don't know by name. But a special thanks to Dean Rayberger, Bill Hart-Davidson, Kristen Mapes, Tina Newhouser, Marcus Fields, Scott Schopery, Maribeth Braid, and dozens of other people who worked astonishingly hard to bring together this conference. It's a lot of work to put a conference on like this, and also to make it affordable, so that the housing was affordable, there were dorms available, the fees charged to students were much lower than in many, many conferences, and all of that's important and leads to a youthful, zestful, innovative kind of circumstance and surroundings for a conference, and that's very important. Second, I'm very proud to sneak preview our new Haystack website, which is still very much in beta and that we will be launching later this summer. A lot of the work on this has been done in-house with the leadership of Kaysi Holman, who's the program coordinator for Haystack at Duke, and Demis Orphanides, who's our Drupal program guru, and who were joined this year by Lisa Taliaferri at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is now half of the host and half of the sponsor for the Haystack as an organization. When we put out bids for redesigning our new Drupal 7 site, they came in starting at $500,000. I think we had $43,000 to build out a new site. What that means is that our team has done a tremendous amount of work on the discovery, the architecture, the redesign, all the details of building a new site. And as you can imagine, it's taken a lot longer than we thought to be doing so much on the site. And I'm about to show you what I think will be a pretty interesting, friendly, user-friendly, that's the bottom line, user-friendly, simple-looking interface on what we've been told is the world's most complicated trafficked academic networking site. There's others more complicated, there are others more trafficked, but none that's more trafficked and more complicated, which means the architecture is very, very difficult to handle. So here is our video, our opening video, narrated by Kaysi Holman, and I'll see if I can figure out how to get it to work. Or maybe I can just, yeah, thank you. Look at this, it's beautiful. Oh, I should, thank you.
Welcome to the beta version of the new Haystack website. Haystack is the world's first and oldest academic social networking service, thanks to a vibrant community of members like you. Our new site is designed to highlight all of the content members have contributed over the years and make it easier than ever to contribute new content. The homepage provides an overview of current activity from the Haystack community. From here, you can view trending posts, curated Haystack picks, comments, most active discussions, and recent posts. When you sign in as a Haystack see your messages from other Haystack members, view and edit your profile, and access your dashboard. The dashboard is a personalized stream based on who you follow, your selected topics of interest, and your group memberships. It allows you to easily see new content of interest to you. From the navigation menu, you can see current Haystack initiatives, including Haystack Scholars, access the Digital Media and Learning Competition Winners Hub, and view recent events and opportunities. You can also explore posts based on main topics. In the past, content was organized based on a larger group of topics and member-generated tags. To streamline, we've identified 6 overarching topics and mapped existing content to them. These topics are teaching and learning practices, humanities, arts, and media, technology, networks, and sciences, social and political issues, educational and cultural institutions, and publishing and archives. This is just a quick glimpse of the newly designed, sleeker Haystack. The site is now ready for testing, and we invite you to help us identify issues and ways to make the website even better.
Thank you. There's going to be 4 laptops set up at a table basically beyond the MSU branded t-shirts in the lobby, the sale racks in the lobby. You can sign up there to be a beta tester for the site. And we need testers. We would love to have people. Some people have actually taught Drupal courses and had students help us beta test, but we are at the next level now. And so we invite you to come play and check it out. My third role is to introduce the incomparable Scott Weingart. Scott is a historian of science who studies early modern communication networks. He won the Forte Prize awarded to the best paper given by a young scholar by the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. He was an NSF Graduate Research Fellow and was Stanford University's first digital humanities data scientist. He's currently Digital Humanities Specialist at Carnegie Mellon University. Scott Weingart is the author of the popular DH blog, The Scottbot Irregular, a co-author of the Historian's Macroscope, has served as a guest editor of the Journal of Digital Humanities, and is an editor of Digital Literary Studies. His public work appears in journals ranging from philosophy to folklore to scientometrics. A scholar of networks and a quintessential networker, this morning Scott Weinberg will be talking with us about the overlaps, connections, and lenses through which we view knowledge and practice. He's delighted to have his talk, Connecting the Dots, live tweeted. Please use the hashtag NETS in addition to the hashtag Haystack 2015 hashtag. That's hard to say. Please join me in welcoming Scott Weingart.
Thank you very much. If you'll bear with me for a second while I switch to wherever my slide deck happens to be. Excuse me. There we go. Thank you again very much to Cathy, to the organizers. It is an absolute honor to be here, and actually I did not know that today would be the day that you're unveiling the new site, and it dovetails really well with what I'm going to talk about today, which, if this will turn on, there's always going to be technical problems at a digital humanities presentation, right? It's one of the laws. There we go. One of the, or perhaps the overarching theme of what I'll be talking today is Haystack itself, which, as we just heard, is Humanities, Art, Science, Technology, Alliance, and Collaboratory. Now, the expansion of this particular organizational name is, it basically, it comes with itself a statement of intent. And that intent is also echoed if you look at the recent CFP for this conference, whose theme, by the way, is the art and science of digital humanities. If you'll bear with me for a second as I read a quote from the CFP. We welcome sessions that address, exemplify, interrogate the interdisciplinary nature of DH work. Haystack 2015 challenges participants to consider how the interplay of science, technology, social sciences, humanities, and arts are producing new forms of knowledge disrupting older forms, challenging or reifying power relationships, among other possibilities. Now, we get this implicit message that disciplines are isolated, that their interplay can somehow influence power structures, and as with a lot of digital humanities, cultural studies, other areas related here, there's a hint of activism involved, that building an intentional bridge is a beneficial activity, and that we're organizing the community of Haystack around this activity. So this is what I'll be discussing today. First, what does disciplinary isolation mean in this context? I put this historically. I'll argue that we have to frame disciplinary isolation in a somewhat rhetorical and historical context in order to have this discussion. And my second point is about ontology. It turns out that the way we talk about isolation is deeply related to the way we think about disciplines and the way we think about disciplinarity. Also the way we illustrate it, and eventually, ultimately, the way we shape knowledge itself. This is what I mean by ontology. My third point will bring us back to Haystack, and in fact bring us back to the Haystack website particularly, and that is Haystack represents an intentional community, and that is the intent is to build bridges. And given that intent, the question is then, how can we use art and science to design a better scholarly community, a more effective scholarly community? And I think that we can use the humanities, use the sciences, use the arts in this fashion to build the community that we want to find ourselves in. So let's begin at the beginning with isolation. Some of you may have seen this before, and I imagine many of you have, because it was a meme that went around the internet for a while. It was the Illustrated Guide to the PhD by Matt Might. And within this circle, you may recall, is the sum of all human knowledge. That's it, that's everything. It's bounded, it's kind of comforting that knowledge just kind of exists in here. You kind of built it up, and the big circle, that's the boundaries of it. And then, this blue dot, that's you, at the very beginning when you're born. It's a beautiful baby picture of all of you in this room right now. And you've got the whole world ahead of you. You've got an entire universe to learn, just waiting at the edges, and you're at the center because you have yet to reach your proverbial hand out and try to study anything in particular. So time passes, you grow, you go to high school, you take your liberal arts, you take your sciences, and you start to expand the circle of what you know into the circle of what is known. College happens, and you notice this odd tumorous growth on the side of your knowledge, which presumably is a side effect of specialization and picking a major. And this is the general process that I imagine everybody in this room went through until you start going to grad school and you specialize further, and you get a master's degree, and you're kind of being pulled inexorably towards the end of the circle of what's known until you start going towards your PhD. So you're no longer a jack of all trades, you're a specialist. This is you're touching the edge of knowledge, and you've now completed your qualifying exams, and you're wondering what lies beyond this circle. Unfortunately, this is it. This is the end of the line. There is nothing that lies beyond this circle, right? This is all of human knowledge. So your job, finishing a PhD, is to poke through, right? Is an horrifically phallic illustration of the PhD process. So you've done it. You've gotten your PhD. You've slightly expanded the circle of the human universe of knowledge, and now you've perhaps wasted 30 years of your life. You're on a job market now, finding difficulties and complications, and you want to know that it's all worth it. And according to Matt Might and Matt Might's model of the PhD, it is, because we have expanded the circle of knowledge. And so everybody here in this room who have finished their PhD and published it and put it online, we've increased the radius of this circle, and that's a good thing, right? That's a comforting thought. We're actually making this circle bigger. And so this is the new world that you helped build, right? You now know more about less than anybody else in the world, and it's great. And though I'm being snarky about it, it's actually kind of an uplifting narrative, and it in fact was shared through the web quite a bit, and a lot of scholars, scientists, and humanists really enjoyed this. And I think it gives you the kind of simultaneous feeling of significance and insignificance that you get when you look at the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, when you look at outer space. I presume all of you, or most of you, have seen this picture. In this picture, there are galaxies, galaxies upon galaxies upon galaxies, 10,000 of them, each with 100 billion stars in them. And you look at that and you feel small, but you also feel big, because you know that humans somehow created glass and shaped it in clever ways, and we were able to see all of this from our tiny vantage point on Earth. And that's exciting. We've expanded the scope of what we're able to see. And this is interesting. And it kind of reminds me of the cosmological world of Pythagoras and the pre-Pythagoreans. Now, as many of you know, the Greek word for order is cosmos. We live in the cosmos. We live in an ordered world. And it consisted of concentric, perfectly layered spheres, with us at the very center of the sphere. And the cosmos was bordered all around by this celestial fire, the light from the heavens. And the stars were pinpricks in the fabric between us and the celestial fire. And if we're beating the Matt Might PhD illustrated model to death, we can say every single PhD is a pinprick in that curtain. And that's really exciting. We're letting the celestial fire from heavens shine through, right? And so, this is a famous old, the Flammarion, it's called, illustration, which really exemplified this approach to the world, that we are peeking our way out through this curtain and we are seeing the light from the heavens, and this is what a PhD is doing. But I promised we'd talk about isolation, and I'm going to beat this metaphor to death so that we can actually get there. We can say that the universe is expanding. The circle of knowledge we're pushing the boundaries of is also expanding. And as it gets larger, as anything gets larger, things get farther apart that were once close together. You and me and Alpha Centauri were all neighbors for the Big Bang, but now Alpha Centauri is 5 light years away, and through the process of super specialization, we are now, everybody in this room, all of our colleagues in chemistry and neuroscience and wherever else, we're far away. It's hard to talk to each other once you get a PhD, once you've become so super specialized. So let's actually play this out from the beginning. We're saying we have sort of in the history of the world, how, and the history of knowledge and the history of science, how does isolation occur? So let's say 2,000 years ago, a white dude from Greece with a beard invented all of science. Everything that we're familiar with in modern Western disciplinary culture, right? Biology and physics and philosophy and administration and NCAA football, he invented them all, right? And at this point, it was easy to be a polymath. You do your thesis on one thing, but because the circle of knowledge is pretty small, you go and you do another thesis on something else, and you and all of your colleagues you all have beards, and you talk to each other, and you rub your beards together. I don't know what they did. And this was easy. This was something you could do. Fast forward a few thousand years, and human knowledge had expanded in the interim. We do get occasional polymaths that people know about, people who are artists and scientists and seem to know everything, but these are becoming rarer. We're in fact at the first age of information overload, right? It's barely possible to be master of all things, and though we remember these scholars, they are becoming fewer and fewer and farther between. So this is the time that we start seeing clever library catalogs, since the multitude of books, that's not supposed to happen. Any thoughts from the tech world? Thank you. And if we have a Mac person in the room, thank you. Nope.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I'll keep going. So anyway, we start seeing the first library catalogs being published because there's so many books that require so much in the way of clever, systematic cataloging schemes. And in fact, if you were to, yeah, that's a good place to be. If you were to walk through Oxford in 1620, for example, you could go see around what is now the Bodleian Library, a series of new buildings that have been built that on the top of them have words like metaphysics and philosophy. We start seeing these fracturing of disciplines, and if you go there today, you'll still see this. Excuse me. So we go a bit further into time, and the circle of knowledge expands. Specialization eventually leads to fracturing. We reach the age of these massive hierarchical schemes that are used as indices for encyclopedias, this of Diderot and D'Alembert. And things get more complex. A few more centuries pass. Some German universities kind of invent the art of super specialization, and they pass it along to American universities. And eventually we get to C.P. Snow talking about the two cultures, and we talk about the fracturing of knowledge. And here we are. And on this edge of our circle now, we've fractured so much that it's impossible to talk to each other. There are these insane barriers in the way, and they're barriers of language and value differences and intellectual incommensurabilities. And it's a big problem, this problem of isolation in the academy. Now, by this point, I hope a lot of you in the audience are worried. Perhaps you're worried because of the isolation issues. More likely, you're worried because of my relatively racist, sexist, Whiggish, Eurocentric approach to history, or my absurdly reductivist discussion of the evolution of knowledge in these very general, weird terms. This was intentional, and it was intentional for a very specific reason, and I hope you'll forgive me, because I did it to prove the point of the value and sort of immediacy and use of visual rhetoric in shaping thoughts. When we use the word imagine, we use it to describe every act of internal creation, whether or not it conforms to the root of the word image. Whether or not we're creating this visual image in our head, this is what imagine comes from. Now, in classical and medieval philosophy, though thought was a visual process, it was actually considered that concepts themselves had visual instantiations, and by putting these visual instantiations to paper, you are, to some extent, finding out about the transcendent nature of the world and the transcendent nature of conceptual relationships. This was deeply connected to something called ars memoriae. And in this concept, concepts were not only given in visual form, they were given order. This order was not a memorization technique, it was a reflection on the underlying structure of the world, the underlying relationships between concepts to one another. And visual representations of these concepts helped bridge human knowledge to divine wisdom. And this is our entrance into ontology. We've essentially been talking about interdisciplinarity for the past 2,000 years, and always alongside a visual rhetoric about the shape or ontology of knowledge, like this Matt-Might model I showed earlier. So over the next 10 minutes, I will trace the interwoven histories of ontology, illustrations, and rhetoric of interdisciplinarity. This will contextualize the current moment and the intention behind meeting at a conference like this one. It should, I hope, also inform how we design our community of Haystack going forward. So let's look at some alternatives to the Matt-Might model historically. Trees were incredibly important to a lot of these early visualizations. When we look at the root of the Germanic word for knowledge, we get American words like wits or wizard. In German, you get things like Wissenschaft. Now, this comes from an ancient word meaning tree or wood or forest. The relationship between trees and knowledge runs very deep, and it's not merely visual. You know, I hear there's a famous book where tree itself is a tree of knowledge, right? Somewhat culturally important. This helps to show that it was impossible to differentiate between visual representations of knowledge as a tree and conceptual representations of knowledge as a tree, as a hierarchy, as a thing that branched. And this tree metaphor had three important aspects to it. The first was genealogical, that we're talking about knowledge as it was created. You know, first somebody invents physics, and then physics branches off into high-energy physics and cosmological physics, and so forth and so forth. This cosmological description was fairly imbued in the metaphor of a tree. The second is one of dependency, and this we get a lot today. You know, chemistry depends on physics, biology depends on chemistry. These are dependency relationships. The last one, which was especially important at this time period when we think about things like the great chain of being, is this transcendent nature of the order of knowledge, that knowledge is connected in a unit. And this is godly, this is a unity. And it took some time for the use of the branching tree as a metaphor to take hold, but once it did, it basically stayed there for centuries. Eventually, we lost a single root as the source of knowledge, and this signaled an epistemic shift in how knowledge was understood, the implications of which are still unfolding in the present day. But by visualizing knowledge as a tree, our ancestors reinforced both an epistemology and a phenomenology of knowledge, ensuring that we would think of concepts as parts of hierarchies and genealogies for hundreds of years. As we slowly moved away from strictly tree-based representations in the last century, we've also moved away from the sense that knowledge is a strict hierarchy. Instead, now we have networked visualizations, and we believe knowledge to be this diffuse and occasionally interconnected system of parts, and often social parts. So, if we start going through these representations in order, we start with a few interesting historical examples, this one of Raymond Lull. It should come as no surprise that medieval knowledge was shaped like a tree, given what we've spoken about. God sat at the root. The great branching of knowledge provided this transcendental order of things. Physics, ethics, biology all branched further and further until tiny subdisciplines sat at every individual leaf. One important aspect of these illustrations was unity. They were whole, they were complete, and even more, they were all connected. Interestingly enough, a lot of these trees you see are surrounded by a chain. And this represents the fact that they are complete in a very final way. There is no growth of knowledge, right? It took until Francis Bacon to start getting beyond this chain-based approach. You start seeing a few important rhetorical, strategical shifts that Bacon introduced in the advancement of learning. The three shifts that are worth commenting on here that Bacon added was, one, it broke from the one root model of knowledge. Bacon separated knowledge into three separate rooted structures, one in history, one in poesy, and one in philosophy. And he did this as a rhetorical strategy. He did this to say, we don't need to look at poesy and history. We should only look at philosophy, natural philosophy, what we now call science, right? And think about how durable this idea has been, that we've got this three separations of knowledge. We've got the history, we've got the poesy, and then we've got the science, and that's the serious stuff we should be concentrating on, right? There were a number of other things that he introduced. One was that it shifted the system from closed to open. It was a system that was capable of growth and capable of change. And lastly, because there was no longer a unity, it didn't have to connect to a divine wisdom. It was no longer transcendent. It was a description of knowledge as practiced, as acted. And these were fairly important shifts, but the shifts didn't get us away from the tree structure as a historical metaphor. So if you start looking at encyclopedias in the 18th century, they're all often still using these trees. One of the early encyclopedias by Ephraim Chambers. Chambers wrote, "The origin and derivation of several parts and the relation in which the disciplines stand to their common stock and to each other will assist in restoring them to their proper places." Their proper places. We still have disciplines and relationships between concepts that have proper places. It wouldn't be until Diderot and D'Alembert, about 50 years later, for them to write an introduction to their encyclopedia where they said, and I quote, "We have chosen a division which has appeared to us most nearly satisfactory for the encyclopedia arrangement of our knowledge, and at the same time for its genealogical arrangement." They went on to describe that we know that concepts don't have natural relationships to one another, but at least we can try to make a tree of their genealogical arrangement, how certain concepts evolved from other concepts. And we will use this as the sort of index to our encyclopedia. So this is interesting. Even with these incredibly advanced, complicated trees, we still couldn't get away from the tree and hierarchical conceptualization of knowledge because it was so deeply rooted. By the way, notice I use the word root or branch of knowledge. These are things that are still in the language that we use today. So what eventually came to be by the 19th century and 20th century, we started losing these visual metaphors of trees, and we didn't really have much to replace them. Once we started realizing that knowledge was non-hierarchical, that concepts weren't particularly related in the ways that we thought that they were related. Herbert Spencer wrote, "Knowledge now and again reunites. They severally send off and receive connecting growths, and the intercommunion is ever becoming more frequent, more intricate, and more widely ramified." In the 20th century, the classification theorist S.R. Ranganathan compared knowledge to the banyan tree from his home country, which is a tree which grows roots up and grows roots down. It's fairly rhizomatic in its structure, and it's the idea that there is no base hierarchy. Around this time as well, we started getting different visual metaphors of knowledge, people playing around, trying to figure out what would work for the new concepts, the new rhetorical understanding of the relationships between disciplines as they were having them. So Paul Otlet conceived of a sort of universal network through which individuals had thought processes. H.G. Wells put through his hat in the ring. His knowledge diagram was actually similar to Matt Might's Illustrated Guide to the PhD, where you start with a child's learning. His is the one on the left. And you kind of branch out through that learning over time. Yet it still wasn't this basic hierarchy that people had been talking about before. And these were interesting developments, particularly because both of them rhetorically placed the ontology of knowledge in the realm of the psychological and the social. It was no longer driven by some underlying conceptual reality or divine reality. It was driven by the way people interact and the way people are in disciplines, and the way people learn. Around this time, we had a bunch of other visualizations that were cropping up. I'm going to go through this. By the 80s, we start seeing a slew of illustrations that we're all pretty familiar with, and that's those sexy node and edge spaghetti and meatball graphs that are becoming incredibly popular these days. And we use them to show citation chains and relationships between disciplines. And they usually go hand in hand with the ontological baggage that we're now used to as well, that knowledge is complex, unrooted, interconnected, and co-constructed. It fits well with the current return to a concept that we mostly left in the 19th century, and that C.P. Snow famously talked about in the two cultures argument, that knowledge is disconnected, that disciplines have incommensurable differences between one another. Kuhn was talking about this as well. But now, with these graphs, we start getting back to the idea that everything is interconnected, but we're thinking about them in new ways, and we're thinking about them in broadly social ways. So there's another set of epistemological baggage that comes with these spaghetti and meatball graphs, too. And here I will quote Ben Fry, who is a famous visualization researcher. He says, "There's a tendency when using networks to become smitten with one's own data, Even though a graph of a few hundred nodes quickly becomes unreadable, it's often satisfying for the creator because the resulting figure is elegant and complex and may be subjectively beautiful. And the notion that the creator's data is complex fits just fine with the creator's own interpretation of it. Graphs have a tendency of making data set look sophisticated and important without having to solve the problem of actually enlightening the viewer. And honestly, if any of you were at that Pink Floyd light show last night, it kind of reminds me of that, right? There's this beautiful, complex set of stars zooming in and out, and you really have no idea what's going on. A lot of these graphs are like that. And it's worth thinking about how the rhetorical strategy of visualizing knowledge in graphs like this, what this says about what we think about how knowledge works, and how this informs how we interact with one another and how we collaborate with one another. Because as we've seen over the past 1,000 years, these visualizations do in fact inform, they are deeply related to the way that we interact and the way we think about the communities that we find ourselves in. And so this brings us back to the outline. The discussion of Haystack, the discussion of intention. Cathy has often described Haystack, as earlier today, as a social network, which, on the web, isn't always an intentionally designed medium. It is something that we create, we build for users to interact in, and the design decisions that we make when we're creating media like this will grant certain affordances to the users of a social website. They will influence the users into acting one way or another. So, for example, the decision you make, is it easier to communicate individually or in a group? Or is it, are certain types of events or communities prioritized? Do they show up higher or lower in a website? These are design decisions that really affect how we're interacting with one another on the website of Haystack, on all of these social websites that we use. And I'm really excited now that we have this new Haystack website coming up to see the sorts of things that they're doing. For example, I noticed the new organizational scheme that will, I believe, really help in the way that scholars use this as an infrastructure to inform the communities they want to find themselves in. So with the design decisions going into Haystack, let's figure out what the intent of Haystack is. I'm going to quote from a 2004 manifesto, fairly famous manifesto between Cathy and David Goldberg. I'm sorry. They wrote, "We believe that a new configuration in the humanities must be championed to ensure their centrality to all intellectual enterprises in the university, and more generally, to understanding the human condition and thereby improving it, and that those intellectual changes must be supported by new institutional structures and values." End quote. So this was, I think, a Haystack rallying cry. How can the humanities constructively inform the world? Notice especially that they called for new institutional structures. So, excuse me. Remember earlier how I talked about isolation? So the story that I weaved around isolation was historically problematic, but it doesn't make the truth of this issue of super specialization, it doesn't make that any less true. It doesn't make it any less of a problem. And so for all its talk of interdisciplinarity, academia is fairly averse to synthesis, to connection on many fronts, super specialization being just one of them. For example, a dissertation based on a synthesis is much less likely to get through a committee than through a single intellectual contribution to a specific field. The Academy is also weirdly averse to writing for public audiences. Popular books won't get you tenure, but every discipline is a popular audience to some other discipline, right? If we're trying to write to other scholars across the world, this is essentially popular writing. This is a way to connect with them. And synthetic and semi-public work is exactly the sort of work that will help with Haystack's goal of a truly integrated and informed academy for social good. But the cards currently are stacked against it. And so I think it hit the nail on the head to talk about institutional structures as a critical point for improvement. And the question is how we can design Haystack and similar communities to affect those institutional structures. This is where design comes in. Recall again the theme this year, the art and science of digital humanities. I propose that we take the next few days to think about how we can use art and science to make Haystack even better at living up to its intent. That is, knowing what we do about collaboration, about visual rhetoric, about the academy, how can we design an intentional community to meet its goals? Perusing the program, it looks like we're already doing this. Perusing the new Haystack website, it looks like the people who are designing it, who are putting these things together, are deeply thinking about it. And I think that we have to have an open discussion about this. So, this is the plug for those of you out there who haven't signed up for a Birds of a Feather dinner session yet. This is actually the subject of a Birds of a Feather dinner session that I'm organizing. So if you'd like to sit and chat about that, go to wherever the sign-ups are right now and please put your name down. So when we talk about structure in the social web, there's a lot of great examples that we can learn from. One example, I think probably the most famous example in this room, is that of Tara McPherson and her colleagues in designing the web publishing platform Scalar, which is the cousin in functionality to WordPress. Now, Scalar was designed with feminist and humanist principles in mind. It allowed for more expressive, non-hierarchical pathways through a set of content that through something like WordPress you'd have a lot more difficulty in creating a website of this sort. Also, when talking of institutional, social, and web-based structures, we can take lessons from history. In early modern Europe, for example, the great network of information exchange, known as the Republic of Letters, relied heavily on actors in this group that became known as hubs. People talked about them as the mailboxes of Europe or the intelligencers of the Republic of Letters. And they helped distribute new research incredibly efficiently in early modern Europe. They were so important that without them, what a lot of people now call the scientific revolution probably wouldn't have happened. It would have fizzled out. But similarly, it wasn't just this hub and spokes model of a network that was helpful. The networks in early modern Europe did, to some extent, operate on a fairly ground up manner. For example, the Atlantic slave trade, which was wreaking untold havoc in the world, can at least teach us some lessons about intentional design of a scholarly world or of a communicative world in general. There existed at that time a rich exchange of medical knowledge between Africans and indigenous Americans that completely bypassed Western Europe, which was the central structure. This is where all of the hubs were. But through the organization of the networks at that time, there was actually this interesting diffusion back and forth between the Americas and Africa of medical knowledge that never trickled up into the sort of higher echelons of the network, of the hierarchical network. And these are lessons that we can learn from. We can also take lessons from the present day. We see certain affordances of social networks that help subvert or reconfigure power structures, as with many revolutions in North Africa, the Middle East, the current activist events taking place around the country about surrounding police brutality and racism. Similar tactics that piggyback on network properties are in fact used by governments to spread propaganda or used by ad agencies to spread viral videos. So the question is then how we can intentionally design a community using principles we learn from historical action as well as modern network science in order to subvert institutional structures in the manner raised by Cathy and David in the 2004 manifesto. We also need to take into account science on teamwork, on collaboration, on group science. We've learned, for example, that teams with diverse backgrounds often come up with more creative solutions to tricky problems. We've learned that many small, agile groups often outperform large groups with the same number of people, and that informal discussions outside the workspace contributes in interesting ways to productivity. If you're interested more in this particular side of the science of collaboration, there's a great book by Michael Nielsen called Reinventing Discovery that's absolutely worth exploring. And so we can use all of these various historical and lab-based examples to inform the design of social networks. Haystack already works towards this goal with its Scholars Program, but there are other steps you can take. For example, you might be able to strategically seek out scholars in disciplines that are currently underrepresented or from groups that are currently underrepresented. So these are different areas that we might learn. So this covers the science But what about the art, the other half of the theme of this year's Haystack? So I spent the entire middle half of the discussion talking about visual rhetoric and the way it's linked to ontological metaphors of knowledge. The tree metaphor of knowledge, for example, was so strongly held that it even fooled Descartes into accidentally breaking his mind-body dualism claims. If you read Descartes' discussions of trees, it is completely subverted by the discussion of a single root of knowledge when looking at mind-body dualism. So here's where the artists in the room can also fruitfully contribute to the same goal. By literally designing a better infrastructure, visually, by helping create visual metaphors, illustrations can be incredibly powerful drivers of reconceptualizations, and we have the opportunity here to affect changes in the academy more broadly. One of the great gifts of the social web, at least when it's designed well, is its ability to let nodes on the farthest limbs of the network to still wield remarkable influence over the whole structure. This is why viral videos, Kickstarter projects, and cats playing pianos can become popular without industry backing, right? And the decisions we make in creating illustrations, in fostering online interactions and designing social interfaces can profoundly affect the way those interactions reinforce, subvert, or sidestep current power structures. So, this is my call to the room now. Let us, over the next 2 days, through the dinners, revisit the discussion of designing the community we want to live in. Let's actually use that feedback mechanism that was brought up earlier in designing the Haystack website and making it a more effective community for the world that we all want to live in. Thank you very much. I don't know if I have time for Q&A. Okay. Or we can all go eat some more. It seems like there's still food out there. Oh, we have a microphone. That's good. Oh, there's a...
Is it on? Check, check. Yeah, anybody have a question?
I'd be interested in knowing, and maybe the answer is yes, maybe the answer is no, if anyone's ever tried to make metaphors for knowledge production beyond the visual, auditory, tactile, other kinds of sensory metaphors. Absolutely. And we have another hand, which may have been actually another answer to that question. Go ahead. Thank you. That'd be great. So there's, for example, people have worked on 3D virtual environments, like Oculus Rift type environments. So you're walking around a museum of one of these maps of science, and this is used to, you can actually use this as a library resource, right? How do you organize library books? Actually, the top floor of the Museum of Natural History in New York City is designed as, the floor design is a phylogenetic tree of the evolution of dinosaurs. And so it's actually very similar in concept to these virtual museum structures. I'll take the other one back there. And then Cathy.
1 second. Since we're streaming, we're going to ask if the audience folks can use the mic, so that way our web people can hear.
Sorry to interject. I have a passion for spatial metaphors for knowledge, which have a long and storied history going back into the medieval memory palaces, and which live on, as you said, in those virtual reality environments, which also, if you think about Microsoft's early Encarta, the mind maze, anybody remember that bit of nostalgia? But as far as auditory ones, I happened across just recently listening to Wikipedia, which is a fascinating little website where you can listen to the edits that are made to Wikipedia, and the tones and durations are based upon what the edits are, where they are, and where they come from, which is quite interesting as a potential line there.
There's another project by, I believe, Sean Graham that sonifies Wikipedia, not the actual words of Wikipedia, but as you're walking through the world, if there are more geotagged Wikipedia articles in a particular location, you will get this louder sound. And if there are fewer, the sound will die down, so you can see where people are talking about, where people are writing about.
Hi, thanks. So I don't entirely want to recover the metaphor of the tree, but there was a reason that they used the metaphor of the tree, and that was that it established that knowledge was not ours. In other words, we did not have mastery over it. And so in a certain sense, the point of the tree was to say it's out there and it's for us to travel out and uncover or learn these things. And so, you know, in the metaphors you gave of the move into the modern era, it's more and more about our mastery of that knowledge. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the question of whether the move towards other metaphors can also resist the move towards personal or subjective mastery of knowledge, as if it's somehow an expression of my subjectivity or my power or something of that nature.
Yes, absolutely. These are certainly deeply linked to one another. This is a biological illustration from the late 19th century of the evolution of birds. And what we see on the left is a phylogenetic tree. And what we see on the right is an interpretation of this author that if you were to take a time slice of the phylogenetic tree and look at it from the top down, can you visually represent the relationship between these birds, these evolved birds, at any particular time? So you have this surface level sort of pseudo-network visualization that has a tree underneath it. And in fact, the modern cartographers of science, I suppose you can call them, are fairly split in this. Some of them, if you talk to them, they will say, yes, underlying each of these networks is a tree that goes back to, you know, ancient Greek and Indian and classical and Chinese thought, and you can actually trace the progression of time. Another set of the cartographers will say, no, this is solely a explanation of a social structure and a set of basically acts and processes by the communities that we've now called academia and disciplinarity. And I think you'll find very different answers to your question depending on who you ask. And so this is something that we're still, there is no unified rhetorical comfort in this area, or philosophical comfort in this area. It's something we're still building. Yeah. And then Cathy after that.
Hey, thanks very much. So to me, the danger of this kind of interdisciplinary discourse is that it gets tribal real quick, right? So we're the interdisciplinarity tribe, and you know, what we have to do is recolonize the academy in our image, because it's been colonized, you know, by those other bad guys, right? And so I think if thinking critically, the question about specialization is, what is that accomplishing? I mean, there are obviously things it's accomplishing that are a little bit troubling from our tribal perspective, but there are other things that are pretty spiffy. I mean, you get these magnificent little critters, you know, digging deep holes and finding stuff that you know, you wouldn't otherwise find. And you know, I often feel like my work is parasitic or, you know, perhaps symbiotic on all those wonderful critters digging away, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's true, or if there's something to that, then maybe we could see interdisciplinarity as being more an emergent property of specialization, something that happens. This is how I was taught it in graduate school. So it's an emergent property of specialization. That's the happy story about it. Or a division of labor where, you know, there are people who do the digging and there are people who do the piecing together. Sure. I'm not sure we have to be fighty about this so much as actually collaborative.
Well, so there are a few things to address there. First is the idea of interdisciplinarity being an emergent property of disciplinarity and specialization, right? And the issue here isn't that that sort of thing will arise. The issue is that there are many extra academic reasons why we form into disciplines, why we super specialize. They're based on institutional inertia, they're based on government funding, they're based on funding by large pharmaceutical organizations, what have you. And there is a lot of power in these extra academic, extra intellectual forces that really shape the way scholars interact with one another. And so you can say, all right, let's step back and let the world do its work. And that's fine. It will be different forces that are enforcing intentional agendas on us than ourselves. And if we're comfortable with that, and if we think that we should allow the natural processes of the world take over, that's all right. With the creation of a website like Haystack, however, there is an intentionality behind it. When you design something, you can either design it saying, I'm just going to, not really think about the affordances and aspects of the design I'm putting into it, or you can say, there is a particular agenda or provocation I want to put forward, and I will design for that. I will not let the current design practices inform how I'm going to create the network that everybody is going to be interacting in. Now, what we can do, we can say, all right, we don't want to be a colonizing force. We can look to as many examples as we can of types of networks that allow people to transform the networks on the fly and let everybody control the growth themselves from the ground up. If we feel that this is a good thing to design towards, we can try to design towards that rather than designing towards whatever our own individual goals are. If the critique is that we shouldn't even be designing towards people being able to design themselves because that itself is a colonization, I feel like there's not much further we can get from there.
Thanks for that great talk. That was really,
Thank you.
really stimulating. I'm going to make two comments that put together both is there a nonverbal way of talking about, a non-visual way of talking about networks, and the colonizing one by doing some little bit of history. Thanks for that 2004 manifesto quotation. I'd kind of forgotten about that. But by the time Haystack put on its first conference, we already felt that we needed to burst open some of the intentionality that we felt was a little too top-down. So our first conference was actually staged 9 months, and different groups of institutions had a month. It was all called the information year, in with a slash for formation year. And we were trying to deconstruct the formation, so it was in community, in common integration. Interface was the one we did it in the research triangle, but several different things. And then we came together for a conference that was in the Art Museum at Duke, and we asked data scientists to sort of look at what all Haystack had done to that point and do a visualization in the virtual reality cave. And that one was all about connection. Tim Lenoir led a group of, who's a historian of science, led a group of VR people, and you could take a word and tie it to a patent from the beginnings of the internet to the present, and you could actually physically visualize connections between the two, and they had a sound to it. And then a composer made a little orchestral something based on his idea of Haystack. The orchestra sat on the stage and played the same music, but we were all mic'd differently, so we were all hearing different things. So it was interesting that two different artists and groups of artists and scientists working together, one saw Haystack as about connection and a history, and one saw it about everybody hearing something differently, even though there was one group all supposedly playing the same thing. But I thought those were just two really interesting nonverbal kinds of metaphors.
That's fascinating. I don't know if those still exist in a way that's interactable, but if they do, I would love to see a tweet about it with the Haystack.
There's a lot of documentation.
Yeah.
I don't know if the things themselves.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Everybody, we're about out of time, so we're going to preserve some time. I have a couple of announcements, but please help me thank Scott Weingart.
Thank you.
One thing.